Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today, I'm going to be presenting my Keystone project titled Silencing the Subversivos. I am Obregón Domínguez. So let's dive in. So my Keystone project was anchored in this research question on how did journalists become the enemies of the state during the Guatemalan Civil War. And in order to kind of dive deeper into that, I wrote a 5-page senior honors thesis that I will be delivering to the history department this upcoming week. The research process was very long and arduous, but thanks to Kilachand, it became really, really fun. With the support and the funding of Kilachand, I was able to do archival research in multiple institutions in Guatemala, and without that process, I would not have been able to complete this project. So thank you so much to Kilachand and to my advisors. Before I start telling you a little bit about my findings, I wanted to provide a brief content warning. This presentation does contain depictions of state-sanctioned violence, mentions of genocide and war, so if you feel like you need to step out, please feel free in doing so. So I wanted to begin by positioning you all in the time period that my presentation takes place on. And I thought that Diego Rivera's Glorious Victory does a really great job at doing that. So this painting depicts the CIA-backed coup of the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with journalists? Well, I argue that in 1954 really marked a turning point in history when it comes to Guatemalan politics and daily life. And that's not only because it stopped this 10-year period of democratic elections, but it also started this sort of weariness in the Guatemalan society of communist subversion. And although communist subversion, especially in the context of the Civil War, comes in different shapes and forms, in the context of late 1950s Guatemala, you were a subversive if you opposed the new US-backed government or if you aligned yourself with Arbenz, who had just been recently ousted, and his more left-leaning policies. Eventually, after 6 years of turmoil, the start of the Civil War happens in 1960, and this would not end until 1996. This is more complex, of course, but for the sake of this presentation, the Civil War was fought between the state and La Guerrilla. All of that to say is that 200,000 Guatemalans lost their lives to this conflict. And the most heartbreaking part of this is that most of those victims were not either aligned with the state or La Guerrilla, they were just collateral of the war. And among those victims were journalists. My thesis argues that journalists were not only victims, but they were active players in this war. And this is because they really became sort of like the watchdogs of democracy during this period by reporting truthfully and honestly. But this got them the label of subversive. So prior to the war, journalists were independent journalists doing their work. By the 1970s and 1980s, they had been labeled as subversives, and we'll go as to why. And by 1990s, all of them had either been murdered, all of them in the screen had either been murdered or forcibly disappeared. So how did this happen? This didn't happen overnight. It's not like in 1978, it was suddenly okay to murder journalists. This happened, it was a process. And essentially, the state was able to erode the independent press and vilify journalists by calling them subversives, but also simultaneously, desensitize the Guatemalan public to the brutality that these folks were going to eventually experience. And this happened in 4 stages, as I argue in my thesis, beginning with intimidation. In the early 1950s to the start of the war, there was a lot of instances of bribing, and these were called FAFAs, and this is when the state would pay journalists to either kill or cover stories that benefited them. But as a new wave of eager journalists came into the profession, those intimidation tactics didn't work anymore. So the state started using threats. And threats came in the form of calls or letters from the president asking journalists to stop investigating something or to stop reporting on something that didn't benefit the state as well. But again, this young journalist did not bow down to the state in this way. So by the 1960s, when the war starts, this sort of next stage of censorship begins. And censorship happened mostly through self-censorship. But it was not because journalists suddenly decided that they didn't want to report on anything about the state, but it's because they were being threatened now by various spells of violence, for example, bombings or attacks, or they were threatened to lose their jobs because, again, most of these newsrooms were funded by the Guatemalan elites, and if the Guatemalan elites were benefited by the state. So this is really also the point in the history when those who self-censor were safe from a lot of that violence, but those who continue to speak up were labeled as subversives or guerrilleros because they were simply just pointing out the abuses that these regimes were committed. And by 1978 to 1981 is where journalists faced the most extreme instances of violence, and that was extrajudicial killings and forcible disappearances. And by 1982, nearly 50 journalists had been murdered or forcibly disappeared. This led to this sort of a period of retreat from 1981 to 1985, in which, of course, the folks who had been murdered or forcibly disappeared were not speaking on it anymore. They had been permanently silenced. And those who still remain in the profession of journalism were now scared to speak out. And then, as I continue with what kind of that meant for Guatemala, next slide, you'll see why this was relevant. So why do we continue to share these stories? Well, first of all, is because as a Guatemalan, I think that it's important to keep recovering Guatemala's historical memory. Guatemala is a beautiful country with beautiful people, but we do have this very shameful past when it comes to the Civil War, where 200,000 Guatemalans died. So I think that continuing these conversations in both personal and scholarly venues is something that's very important to remember the victims of this terrible, terrible time in our history. Second of all, I think it's also important to continue looking into these sort of case studies to understand the history of the press and how the press can be it can experience repression, because this is not isolated only to 1970s Guatemala. These sort of cycles of intimidation, censorship, and eventual violence can be seen all over the world and all over history, really. And then number three is to learn to detect authoritarian regimes. As I mentioned before, the press was sort of this last level of defense that Guatemalans had because they were keeping the state accountable. The moment that they were either forcibly disappear or murder, event is extreme, like really after that in 1982 to 1984, that's when Guatemala saw the worst time for violence for all civilians, that being the genocide of indigenous Guatemalans and the forcible disappearances and murders of college students and union members in the city. And then number four is, and this is the most important part of all, we continue to share the stories because we have to honor the victims of the war. There's 200,000 Guatemalan families who have lost a loved one to this. And this didn't happen 100 years ago or 200 years ago. This happened 40 to 50 years ago. So it's very recent, and it's important that we continue to share these stories. Thank you so much.
We have about 4 minutes for any questions in the audience.
A great presentation. On the slide right before this one, there was a headline that said, like, Ejército ofrece, like, paz y trabajo, which is kind of laughable if we think about what we know. I was wondering how aware the public was of these disappearances, or if they just sort of, like, saw the shift in their press, and they're like, oh, things are, like, getting so much better.
Right. Essentially, after you had this kind of period of violence against journalists, a lot of newsrooms and newspapers decided to start, giving either trivial news like articles or whatnot, or providing articles that really kind of benefited the state. And this was because of how the state had kind of eroded the press and vilified anyone who opposed it from the 1960s. By the time this happened in the 1980s, it was just kind of justified that all of these journalists were being persecuted or murdered because they were labeled as subversives or guerrilleros. So especially if you were in the capital, now that you didn't have the journalists to report on what was going on in the rural areas, like with the genocide of indigenous Guatemalans, or and you were only kind of getting the headlines that they were being murdered, but because reporters were either scared or they were, kind of appeasing the government, a lot of these headlines of journalists being murdered also didn't have all the information. If you go through the archives, it's kind of ambiguous as to the way of how they died. But once you start doing some more research, you see that the way that they disappeared, they were murdered, were through tactics that were very, that were related to how the government operated at that time.
Really great presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering if in your research you saw any connections to like the American watchdog era of journalism that was happening a couple years around this time.
Well, I think that when it comes to the press, like I said, this is specific to Guatemala, but the press, especially the Guatemalan press, because we're so connected to American, both politics, life, and the way of journalism, there is definitely some parallels. Really, it was kind of incredible to see how the American press and the Guatemalan press were kind of going head to head in the beginning when they were developing into this like big independent newsrooms. And it was really, once Guatemala entered this sort of era of political turmoil and civil war, that they diverged. And you see, and that's why this is really a warning sign to journalism, because this can happen no matter where the press is operating. So.
Thank you, Emma. This is just amazing. Could you speak to the place of your project in the larger efforts for historical memory of this era in Guatemala? Like, could you talk a little bit about the development of the archive or the archival collections that you were working in, and kind of other scholarly or non-scholarly efforts that you think are relevant here?
Absolutely. So. A lot of the archives were created post-war, and it has been through the efforts of a lot of people trying to, again, conserve and recover this historical memory. I think that my project and my research falls in this sort of gap that there was. There's a lot of information about the persecution of college students and of union members and all of these other outspoken opposition groups that were happening at the time. But because the press was not inherently opposing the government, they were just criticizing, as an independent press would do, any sort of abuse by the state. There's not a lot of information on them. So, and a lot of the information that there is only paints journalists as victims. So the work that I wanted to do is kind of giving, really showing journalists as how they were. There were this very outspoken, very authentic and strong voices during this time that I think often when we're kind of like reviewing history, that's kind of erased from them in a way. And with the archives, I was able to do that because in there you can see what they were writing at the time, their columns, the way that they were criticizing the government in the newspapers, something that you don't really find a lot in the human rights reports and whatnot. So there was a lot of work that I did there in the archives that really helped me understand every single one of them and really present that to you guys. So thank you.